Lesson 22, the demonstrative pronouns is and īdem. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on lesson 22, that's on page 65. And today we're going to start talking about demonstrative pronouns. Okay, here in the very first section, section 190, it says definition, a demonstrative pronoun points out the noun or pronoun to which it refers. Okay, so in English, it would be words like this or that. Okay, this car, that dog, this book, that, that computer, this and that. That's basically what demonstratives are, because as they say here, you're pointing things out. You're indicating to someone which thing you're talking about or what thing you're talking about, or person or place or anything, okay? So the word demonstrative actually comes from a Latin word. We have a verb monstro, M-O-N-S-T-R-O, monstro, which means to point out. And if you add the preposition de, to it, you get de monstro. So that's what it is. The root of this word means to point something out. And it's interestingly, it's related to our English word monster. Because originally a monstrum, that's a noun, was like a sign or something, a portent that pointed something out or showed something. But it could be a scary thing. It could be sort of an ominous thing. And I think that's how it eventually got to be associated with the word monster. It's kind of a long story, but they are related. But anyway, the basic idea here is, Latin monstro means to point out something. And so a demonstrative is something that helps you point out something with your speech when you say this or that. Before we get too far into the lesson, I want to mention one thing that I think will help you in a general sense, and that is to understand that there are two flavors of demonstratives. You have demonstrative pronouns, and you have demonstrative adjectives. So let's talk about that for a second. What's the difference between a demonstrative pronoun and a demonstrative adjective? Well, let's think about pronouns and adjectives in general. A pronoun, as I've said many times, is a word that takes the place of a noun. Okay, so a pronoun is going to have substance to it. An adjective is a word that describes a noun, or in more grammatical terms, it modifies a noun. Okay, if my friend Bob walks in to the coffee shop, I can say, hey, there's Bob. He is my friend. And so the word he is a pronoun. Okay, it has substance to it. It's taking the place of a noun. If I have a coffee cup on my table at the coffee shop and I say, this is a brown cup, the word brown is an adjective. It's modifying the word cup. Brown by itself does not have any substance, really, in the way we're using it there. It's just simply attached to the word cup. It's a brown cup. It's modifying cup. You can use an adjective in a way that gives it substance, and that's called a substantive. For example, if I have two mugs or two cups on the table, one is brown and one is red, and I say, would you like the brown or the red? Okay, in that example, brown and red are still adjectives, but they have more meaning packed into them. They have the idea that they are referring to cups. And so the idea of cup is sort of understood. The person listening to me knows what I mean, that it means brown cup or red cup. So in that way, those adjectives have substance. And so we could call that a substantive use of an adjective. Other examples of substantives would be sayings like, only the strong survive. Only the strong what? The word strong is an adjective. But there it's being used as a substantive to mean the strong in the sense of strong beings, strong people, strong animals, perhaps. Okay, so we have pronouns, adjectives, and substantive adjectives. Okay, different grammatical things just to have in the back of your mind, just for knowledge. Okay, so what's my point in saying all this? My point is that demonstratives can be used as adjectives or pronouns. So let me give you an example. Let's take the word this in English, which is a demonstrative. I can use it as an adjective. I can attach it to another word, such as the word cup. I can say this cup. In that example, the word cup is a noun, and the word this is a demonstrative adjective modifying the word cup. What cup are you referring to? This cup, okay? Adjective and noun together. This cup. So the word this is a demonstrative adjective. But what if the person I'm talking to already knows that I'm referring to the cup? Or what if I'm pointing to the cup? So I could say, this is nice. This, I could talk about it just using the word this to refer to the actual object. I could say, do you want this? And so when I use the word this in that kind of way, it's acting as a pronoun. It's taking the place of a noun. Instead of saying, the cup is nice, I can say, this is nice. Instead of saying, do you want the cup? I could say, do you want this? So there's the difference there between a demonstrative adjective and a demonstrative pronoun. Okay? One last quick example. If I say to my friend, do you want this? And I point to the cup, the word this is a demonstrative pronoun because it has substance. But if I put the word cup in and say, do you want this cup? Now I've transformed it to where the cup is the noun, and now the word this is simply modifying the word cup. So I've turned the word this from a pronoun into an adjective. So this by itself is a demonstrative pronoun. This cup, in that example, the word this is acting as an adjective, so it's a demonstrative adjective. So my point here is that we have two flavors of demonstratives. We have demonstrative adjectives and demonstrative pronouns. Okay? And so in English, we can use a demonstrative as either one. We can use the word this as a demonstrative adjective, or we can use the word this as a demonstrative pronoun. Same word, we can use it either way, okay? Same with the word that. Same with the word these. Same with the word those, okay, for plurals. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you all this is because it's the same thing in Latin. In Latin, we have the same situation in that demonstratives in Latin can be used adjectivally as adjectives, or they can be used with substance as demonstrative pronouns, okay? So if you see a Latin demonstrative by itself, it's probably acting in a pronoun kind of way, as a demonstrative pronoun. But if you see a demonstrative agreeing with a noun, it's probably being used as a demonstrative adjective, okay? So you just have to look at the context to see which one it is. As you read along, the context will help you understand how it's being used, okay? And so the reason I told you all that is because I think that's going to clear up some things for you as we head into a discussion of demonstratives. With that knowledge in your back pocket, I think it will help you and it will pay dividends as you go forward, because the pronouns we have in this particular lesson are not the only pronouns you have in Latin. We have more to come. Somewhere around lesson, I believe, 30 or 31, you have a whole slew of pronouns to learn about. In fact, let's take a look. Right, so lesson 31, in the future, you will learn lots more pronouns. You'll learn hic and ille.
That's the Latin way to say this and that. Okay? Hic, H-I-C, hic means this. Ille, I-L-L-E, ille means that. And so you are learning those in the future in Lesson 31. Those are true demonstratives in the sense of this and that, okay? The demonstratives that we're learning in this lesson have a little bit of a different flavor to them, which I'll explain. So let's take a look at what we have here. The first set of demonstratives that we have is what we call is, ea, id. Okay? Is, ea, id. Some people call it a weak demonstrative because it's not quite as strong as this or that. You know, it's not quite that strong. It's more of it's the kind of demonstrative that can be translated as simple pronouns like he, she, or it. But you can also translate it as this or that, depending on the context. In fact, I've even read that sometimes the best translation for is, ea, id really is just the word the. You know, when you learn Latin, they tell you that there is no word for the, that you can't say the in Latin. But in my experience, and I've heard other people say this, sometimes the best way to translate is, ea, id is simply the. And in English, we call the word the an article, specifically the definite article. Okay, so here in section 190, it says one of the demonstratives is, ea, id, and then in italics, it says that, he, she, or it. I would add to that list the word the. In some instances, I think you can translate it as the. Let's skip over īdem. That's the other thing we're going to learn in this lesson. Let's skip over that for the moment and go down to section 191. Okay, it says uses of is. Okay, they're going to tell us how is, ea, id, this new pronoun we're learning, this new demonstrative, how this particular one is used. It says, A, there is no special pronoun of the third person, but is may be used as such. Okay? So what they're saying here is that in Latin, we don't really have a pronoun that means he or she or it. It doesn't really exist, but is, ea, id can mean that. So let's turn now to the back of the book and let's look at a paradigm or a chart of all the different forms of is, ea, id. Let's try to familiarize ourselves with the different forms so that we can recognize them when we see them. And you'll find the chart on page 258 in the appendix at the very bottom. Okay, and you'll see here they have the meanings for is as this, that, he, she, or it. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, you can say the also as a translation, as a possible translation. So when we say is, ea, id, what we're saying there is the nominative singular forms, okay? And as you see in the chart here, that's in the upper left-hand corner. Is masculine nominative, ea is feminine nominative, id is nominative neuter singular, okay? So those particular forms of is, ea, id could be the subjects of sentences. As you look around at these forms, you're going to notice that they look a little bit like second declension forms in the masculine and neuter, and they look a little bit like first declension forms in the feminine, okay? So these endings won't be completely foreign to you. It's just going to be kind of a mix, and so you just need to familiarize yourselves with these forms. The basic root of this word is really just the letter E. It's basically just the letter E plus, endings. Let's take a look at the plural forms for the nominative case. Notice that in the masculine nominative plural, the ending is just a long I, just like in the second declension. So those are the nominative forms of is, ea, id. And as we look at the other forms of is, ea, id, you're going to see that some parts of the declension pattern look very similar to first and second declension nouns and adjectives.
So let's take a quick look around the chart. Let's look at the ablative plurals. Notice that it's is is the ending with a long I, macron over the I. That's just like the first and second declensions, right? And ablative singular, we have long O for masculine and neuter, long A for feminine. That's just like the first and second declensions, right? In the accusative singular, we have as the ending for the masculine, am is the ending for feminine accusative singular. Of course, for neuter nouns, the nominative and accusative will always be the same. So we have id, again, as the neuter accusative singular. Eos, eas, and ea for accusative plural. That looks just like the first and second declension. Dative plural, we have a long I and an S as our ending. That looks just like the first and second declension. In the genitive plural, we have orum, arum, and orum as our endings with a long O. Again, that's just like the first and second declension. So for a lot of this chart here, a lot of these forms, it's just the letter E plus first and second declension endings, the ones you're already familiar with. Okay, but there are two places on this chart where it does not fit that pattern. So let's talk about that a moment. In Latin, we have a class of adjectives that some Latin teachers call the naughty nine. Okay, why are they called the naughty nine? Well, they're called nine because there are 9 of them, and they're called naughty because they don't behave the way they're supposed to. Okay, in the genitive singular and dative singular, they have unusual endings. So what kinds of words are in this group that we call the naughty nine? Well, we have adjectives like alias, which means other. We have adjectives such as neuter, which means neither. We have ulus, which means any, like any, any. Okay, so I could go on and mention all 9 of them, but that will suffice. My point here is that there's a class of adjectives that have a different than expected ending for the genitive singular and dative singular. Let's turn for a moment to page 252 in the appendix, and let's look at a few of these. In the middle of the page, you have section 12, which contains 4 naughty nine adjectives, okay? Alias, Altair, neuter, and unus, okay? Let's look at alias first. Okay, so this is supposed to be a first and second declension adjective. Of course, this is singular only because the idea of another is inherently singular. So we have only singular forms here. So it's ali plus the noun endings. Okay, so alius with a us ending for nominative masculine, alia with an a for nominative feminine, aliud for nominative neuter. So you have a d there at the end instead of a ending that you might expect. But what I would really like to draw your attention to is the genitive singular forms here. Notice that it's ius as your ending, okay? Somehow that I that was short in the nominative forms now has a macron and a us after it. And furthermore, they're all the same. You don't have a genitive, masculine form and then a differently spelled genitive feminine form. They're all alius with a long I. So the other guy in Latin is alius, but if you want to say of the other guy, genitive, it would be alius. Furthermore, if you're expecting this to look kind of like the first and second declension, you would expect the letter O to be the ending in the dative singular. But look what we have instead. We have alii. A-L, short I, long I. In the ablative singular, we have an O with a macron, which you would expect. And then in the feminine, an A with a macron. But the dative does not look like the ablative.
In the dative, instead, you have a long I as your ending. So this is the classic behavior of the naughty nine adjectives, okay? Naughty nine adjectives have IUS for the genitive singular endings, and they get a letter I ending in the dative singular. As someone who is new to Latin, you might look at alias, alia, aliud, and think, oh, dative singular would be alio, right? No, it's alii. It's got that long I ending in the dative singular. Okay, so let's move on to another one, Altair. Again, this is singular only. Notice again, in the genitive singular, for all three genders, we have IUS. So we have alterius, and then in the dative singular, alteri. Looking at the charts below that one, neuter and unus, notice that in the genitive singular for neuter, we have nutrius, and then there's the letter I again on the dative singular, nutri. Same for unus, una unum. In the genitive, we have IUS. In the dative, we have a long I in the dative singular. So all four of these here on page 252 here in section 12, these are all members of the naughty nine. These are all part of that special class of adjectives that have a different than expected genitive singular and dative singular ending. Okay, so turn back to page 258. Keep all that in mind, and let's look at id. And what do you see in the genitive singular? You see the IUS ending for all the genitive singulars. So eius, eius, eius. If you really were expecting this to look like the first and second declension, you might expect AE, an E and an I to be the genitive singular. But that's not what we get. Instead, we get something that looks a lot more like a naughty nine adjective, right? Except here the I is short. It's not a long I, like in the naughty nine. But the spelling is similar. In the dative singular, however, we do have a long I. So in the dative singular, we have AE, and it's like that for all three genders. So let's imagine a moment what this would look like in a sentence. Okay, let's say you want to say, I see him, okay? Him, in that sentence, is a direct object. So if it's a masculine, person, like the word him, in Latin, you could use eum for that. You could say, video eum, I see him, okay? So the accusative masculine singular, eum, could serve that purpose. If you want to say, I see her, well, you could say eam. That's a feminine accusative form of id. If you wanted to say with them, you could say eis. That's an ablative plural. You could say cum eis, and that would translate in English to with them. So pretty normal, the examples we're looking at. But what about dative? What if you want to say, I gave the book to him? Okay, in that case, if you wanted to use a form of id, you'd say ae. You would not say ao. That would be a mistake. Okay, this has the characteristics of a naughty nine, so it's going to have the letter I there in the dative. So if you want to say I gave the book to him, you'd say I gave the book ae. And same for if I gave the book to her, it's spelled the same for feminine and neuter. I gave the book to her, I gave the book to it. Still AE. In the genitive plural, if you have a book that's being owned by more than one person and you want to say it's their book, you could say eorum. But in the genitive singular, you're not going to have AE like you would in the second declension. Again, you're going to have this naughty nine kind of spelling with IUS. So you're going to have eius, okay? So the point here I'm making is that id has endings that look largely like first and second declension endings, except for the genitive singular and dative singular. Those particular endings resemble the naughty nine because of the IUS ending in the genitive singular and the long I ending in the dative singular. Okay, those two forms resemble the naughty nine class.
Okay, so we've taken a cursory look at the different forms of Isaiah id. Now I want to tell you something very important here. It's on page 65, so let's all turn back to page 65 and let's look at section B here under section 191. So that's 191B. It says, when used as a personal pronoun, the forms of is do not refer to the subject of the sentence, but to some other person or thing. Okay, from the view of a translator, someone who wants to translate Latin, this is extremely important. And so what we have here is a big difference between English and Latin that we need to talk about. And for those of you who have read my book, Keep Going with Latin, you've already discovered this, and in that book I talk about it quite a bit. The basic idea is that in English, words like his or her or its can be ambiguous. And here on page 65, they give us an example. They say, the chief saw his friend. Okay, that's a little example sentence that they're working with here in section B of section 191. The chief saw his friend. Okay? In English, we don't know who his refers to. Same thing if it's feminine. The queen saw her friend. Okay? So depending on the context, the word his could be referring to the chief, or let's just use the word king for the sake of convenience. The king's friend, or it could be referring to someone else's friend. Let's think of a context here in which we could make it mean either one. Let's say the king was lonely. He was sitting in the courtyard of his castle, but he felt better because the king looked up and the king saw his friend. Okay? In that context, when it says the king saw his friend, it's clear that it's the king's friend. Okay? So the word his means, in that particular context, that the friend belongs to the king. Now let's imagine a different context that will recontextualize the way we see the word his working in that sentence, okay? Let's say the king goes to Fred's birthday party, okay? The king goes to Fred's birthday party. He sees all the people that are important to Fred. He sees his wife, his sister, his son, his friend, okay? The king sees his friend. Now, in that context, the word his means that it's Fred's friend, not the king's friend, okay? So in English, depending on the context, the word his could refer back to the subject of the sentence, something that belongs to the subject, or something that belongs to somebody else. Same thing with the word her. You know, the queen saw her friend. The queen was lonely. She was sitting in her courtyard, but she looked up and was happy because she saw her friend. Okay, that's the queen's friend. But if the queen goes to Sheila's birthday party and sees all the people that are important to Sheila, she sees Sheila's husband, Sheila's sister, Sheila's son. She sees her friend, okay? In that context, the queen is not seeing her own friend, but Sheila's friend. Okay, so my point here is that in English, his or her can refer to the subject or somebody else. But in Latin, it's not like that. In Latin, they have a separate word for if it belongs to the subject and a separate word for if it belongs to somebody else, okay? So in English, you can't specify it. It's just his or her. But in Latin, you can specify by using a different word for each of those uses, okay? So that's the big difference. Look at the last line of section B here. It says, well, the next to last line and last line. It says, princeps suum amicum vidit. Okay, it's saying the leader saw his friend, okay? For the word his,
in Latin, they've used suis, sua, suum. Okay, that particular adjective, that's the one that means that it belongs to the subject. So oftentimes in translations, they'll not only say his or her, but they'll also put in the word own, his own or her own, okay? That means it belongs to the subject. So when you see that sentence, princeps suum amicum vidit, because it's using suum, you know it belongs to the princeps, the leader, okay, the chief. If you want to say that the friend is someone else's friend, you have to use a form of our new word for this lesson, is id. We noted that the genitive singular forms of is id in all three genders is eius, which is spelled E-I-U-S. And so that's what we have to use if we want to say his or her or its, but it belongs to somebody else other than the subject of the sentence, okay? And we see that here in the middle of section B. It says, princeps eius amicum vidit. Okay, the chief saw, literally, the friend of that guy, or the friend of that woman, or the friend of that thing. We don't know. Eius could be masculine, feminine, or neuter. We just don't know. But it's definitely not the princeps's friend. It's someone else's, okay? So if you want to say that the princeps saw his own friend, you would have to use sua, sua, suum. If you want to say the princeps saw somebody else's friend, you would use eius. Okay, so you have a separate word for each of those two uses. One last quick note, it's different grammatically. When you use sua, sua, suum, it's a first and second declension adjective agreeing with the amicum, with the thing that you're seeing, right? With eius, it's not an adjective, it's really a pronoun. And you're putting it in the genitive case. So it's of that guy. So one's an adjective, and one is really acting as more of a pronoun. One agrees with the noun in case, number, and gender. The other does not agree with the noun in case, number, and gender. Notice that amicum, in the first example with eius, notice that amicum is accusative, but eius is genitive. So eius is possessing amicum. They're not agreeing with each other, as if it was suum amicum, okay? So sua, sua, suum functions differently, grammatically speaking, than eius does, okay? So that's just something to take note of. So what's my overarching point here? The point is that his and her in English can be ambiguous in this kind of sentence, but in Latin it's not ambiguous because there's a different word for each use, if it's the subject possessing it or someone else possessing it. Okay, so we've covered is, ea, id. Now it's time to talk about the other demonstrative that we need to learn in this lesson. And that demonstrative is called īdem, okay? I-D-E-M with a long I. And īdem is how we can say same in Latin, okay? If you want to say, you know, we're all going to ride in the same car, or, hey, are you wearing the same pair of pants you wore yesterday? Or, I've lived in the same house for 50 years. Okay, all those examples of how I just said same, okay? If you want to say things like that in Latin, you would use īdem. So let's take a look at the different forms of īdem by turning to the appendix. That's page 259. It's the next page over from is, ea, id. And let's take a look at the different forms of īdem, and let's compare them to is, ea, id. Why would we want to compare them to is, ea, id? Because īdem is basically is, ea, id, but with a special ending attached. So basically, all the different forms of īdem basically are is, ea, id, but with dem
tagged on to the end, okay? Now, you might be asking the question, why is it īdem instead of īdem? So if we have is, and then we add dem, that ought to give us īdem, right? Not īdem. And here's what I think is the explanation for this. I've seen this in ancient Greek quite a bit. I think that originally it probably was īdem, I-S-D-E-M, but eventually the S dropped out because it's hard to pronounce. It's hard to pronounce an S sound right before a D sound. Try it. Try it yourself. īdem doesn't really roll off the tongue very well. And, you know, in linguistics, there are certain rules you have about how the mouth takes shortcuts, you know. So I think that the S just dropped out before the D sound. And another thing to notice is that in the word is, the I is short. But in īdem, you have a long I. And so in ancient Greek, you have something called compensatory lengthening, okay? Compensatory lengthening is when you have a consonant that drops out, but the vowel before it gets lengthened to compensate for the fact that the consonant went away. And so that's another reason why I think that originally it was īdem, and then the S dropped out, because you have a long I here in the word īdem. So what it looks like to me is the S dropped out, and then the letter I was lengthened due to compensatory lengthening. And you see this kind of thing, as I just said a moment ago, you see this in Greek, where certain sounds drop out before other sounds. So basically, you have an adjustment here to the spelling because of that consonant combination. We're going to see other places like that in the different forms of īdem, where you get a slight spelling change. Okay, so nominative, masculine singular, īdem, again, this means same. So if you have a masculine noun, let's say you have a man, wir, V-I-R, wir means man, and you want to say the same man, you could say īdem wir, okay? Feminine, nominative singular, you have eadem. So if you have a woman, you could say eadem femina, the same woman. And again, that's just ea with the dem tagged onto the end. In the neuter, you have idem with a short I. I believe the reason for this is that the D sound in id and the D sound in dem just collapsed down into one letter D. There was no reason to have two Ds. So I don't think getting rid of a doubled consonant is going to lengthen the vowel with compensatory lengthening. So notice that in idem, the neuter form, you have a short I, whereas in masculine, īdem, you have a long I. In the nominative plural forms, you have īdem, eidem, eadem. Those are just the regular forms of id with dem attached to the end. Now, before we go on, I want to point something out to you, that the different forms of īdem, since they end with dem, that means that the form of the pronoun, the case and number, is not going to be reflected in the ending of the word, okay? Every form ends with dem. So that means that the form of the word is going to be indicated by something in the middle of the word, okay? Because, as I said a moment ago, it's just id with a dem ending. So the inflected endings of this demonstrative will be really in the middle of the word. Let's continue on taking a quick look at the different forms of īdem. Let's look at the genitive row. We have eusdem is the same for all three genders. We have some interesting things to look at in the genitive plural. Take a look at the masculine genitive plural. It's eorundum, okay? The form of id here is eorum with an M, but in the form of īdem, the M turns into an N, and instead of eorumdem, you get eorundum. And so why is this? The answer is that it's just hard to say an M sound before a D sound. If I were to try to say eorumdim, my mouth would have to make big movements. Eorum, my lips would go together, and then I'd have to make a big movement to set up my lips and tongue to make the D sound. But if I say eorundim, then when my mouth starts to make the N sound, my tongue is right there where it needs to be to articulate the D that comes next. So eorundim is not very hard to say. So that's why the M changes into an N. Spelling changes like this, they fall under a large umbrella term called euphony. And euphony basically just means something that sounds good. It just means that the spelling change is done to make it sound good. Also, as I said before, the human mouth likes to take shortcuts. The human mouth likes to, make things easy to say. It doesn't like to have to jump around and make big changes to pronounce things, especially when you're talking fast. The faster you talk, the smaller the movements need to be that you're going to make when you say things. And as we go along in this book, we're going to see another common linguistic phenomenon in Latin called assimilation, when one letter gets changed into another letter to make it like the next one. That's very common in Latin. So you have some spelling changes that happen in Latin, and they follow basic linguistic rules. So you learn a little bit about linguistics as you go along. Moving on to the feminine genitive plural, again we have M turning into N. So instead of earumdim, we have earundim. And in the neuter, same thing. M turns into N. In the dative case, we have very simple spellings. It's just the forms of is, id with dem, īdem, īstem. In the accusative row, we see, again, the phenomenon of the M turning into N before the letter D. So instead of eumdim, we have eundim. Instead of eamdim, we have eondim. In the accusative plural, we don't have any surprises, just the regular forms of is, id with dem, and the same thing in the ablative. Again, I think it's interesting that the case indicator is in the middle of the word now. So eodim, the thing that makes it ablative there is the O, which is now no longer at the end. It's kind of in the middle of the word. So that's interesting to note. Okay, so those are the forms of īdem. So ways you might see these words used in a sentence might be things like, an ablative of means. If I want to say something like, I'm drinking from the same cup, I might say, I'm drinking ex eodem poculo. Okay, eodem is neuter ablative singular, and poculo is ablative singular for poculum, which means cup. So ex eodem poculo would be from the same cup. If I want to say something like, I'm giving money to the same soldier, I could say īdem militi. Put those things in the dative case. Īdem is dative, militi is dative. So to the same soldier would be īdem militi. If I want to say something like, the same women are here today that were here yesterday. Same women, I could say īdem feminae. Īdem is feminine plural nominative, and feminae means women. That's first declension nominative plural. So īdem feminae means the same women. Okay, so those are just a few examples of how you might see īdem used in a sentence. Okay, let's move along now to section C at the bottom of page 65, turning back to our lesson. It says here, demonstrative pronouns, when used as adjectives, agree in gender, number, and case with the noun they modify. If you'll remember back to the beginning of this lesson, I mentioned to you that demonstratives, both in English and in Latin, have two flavors. They can be adjectives or they can be pronouns. Okay, you can have a demonstrative pronoun that has substance, or you can have a demonstrative adjective that simply just agrees with a noun. And already the authors of this textbook are talking about that. So at the bottom of page 65, they're mentioning when these demonstratives are used as adjectives. Okay? When that happens, they agree in case, number, and gender with the noun they modify, just like any other adjective. And they have a few examples here. Id flumen, here at the top of page 66, flumen is a third declension noun that's neuter, and it means river. So if you want to say that river, and you want to use isaiah id, you would take the neuter form, id, and it would need to agree in case, number, and gender. So id and flumen are both nominative singular neuter. So id flumen means that river, or possibly the river. As you can see, they have three examples here, one from each gender. So īdem vicus. Vicus is masculine. Okay, so vicus means village. It's masculine, nominative singular. So if you want to say the same village, you need the masculine nominative singular form of īdem, which is īdem. So īdem vicus means the same village. And finally, ea legio. Legio is third declension, and it means legion, and it's feminine. So if you want to say that legion, you have to use a feminine form of isaiah id. Okay, so ea legio, both of them are feminine, both are singular, both are nominative. Okay, so the different forms of isaiah id and īdem, when they are used as demonstrative adjectives, they have to agree with the noun they go with, just like any other adjective would. Moving on to section D, it says is or īdem is often used as the antecedent or in agreement with the antecedent of a relative pronoun. In the last lesson, lesson 21, we spent a long time going over relative pronouns, so hopefully you're prepared to understand these examples. Okay, we have a couple of examples here. Ei qui castra defendunt. Those who defend the camp. Okay? So ei is a form of isaiah id. It's nominative, masculine, plural. So we could translate it as they. In this translation, they're translating it as those, which is fine. Same thing. So the relative pronoun is qui castra defendunt. So the antecedent is ei, and as we talked about extensively in the last lesson, qui, the relative pronoun, will get its number and gender from the antecedent, but its case from the role it plays in the relative clause. So ei is masculine, qui is masculine. Ei is plural, so qui will be plural, but qui will be nominative because that's what it's doing in the relative clause. It's being the subject, okay? Who defend the camp. That's the structure. So qui is the subject within the relative clause. Remember that castra is generally plural. So castra is always written plural, but translated as the singular word camp. So castra is neuter accusative plural. Second declension. So why is this example here? They're just simply showing you an example of how you will see isaiah id used in the writings of Julius Caesar, which is what this whole textbook is based around. The whole textbook is based upon Caesar, getting you ready to read Julius Caesar. Another example, ea legio quae est in castris. Okay, again we have a form of isaiah id. This time it's being used as an adjective. Okay, in the first example, ei was just by itself. It was being used as a demonstrative pronoun. Here in this second example, ea is being used simply to modify legio. So we could say here that ea is a demonstrative adjective, not a demonstrative pronoun. And again, legio means legion. It's feminine, so we have ea, a feminine form of isea id. So ea legio says that legion or the legion. And then we have the relative clause, quae est in castris, with the relative pronoun quae. So it's that legion which is in the camp. Okay, so the antecedent of quae is legio. Legio is singular, so quae will be singular. Legio is feminine, so quae will be feminine. Okay, it gets those characteristics from its antecedent, which is legio. But quae will be nominative because within the structure of the relative clause, it's the subject, okay? Which is in the camp, okay? Which is the subject. So that legion, which is in the camp. Okay, so they're just giving you a couple of example sentences here just to show you how you'll see these words used. You'll see isea id used as a demonstrative adjective. You'll see it used as a demonstrative pronoun. You'll see it used as the antecedent of a relative pronoun. Great, let's move on now to section 192, which is our vocabulary section for this lesson. First we have mors, mortis. That's a third declension feminine noun that means death. We have lots of English words that are related to this word. We have words like mortician, mortuary, mortality. One thing you'll notice about English derivatives of third declension Latin nouns is that the derivative usually includes the genitive stem, not the nominative singular form. So the nominative singular here is mors, but that doesn't really make it into English derivatives. The part that makes it into English derivatives is the genitive stem part, which is mort. That's the genitive singular form with the ending chopped off. Okay, if you take the genitive singular form and you chop off the ending, you are left with the genitive stem. So that stem, or some textbooks call it a base, some older textbooks. In fact, I believe this one calls it a base. I think more modern textbooks call it the stem. I call it the genitive stem just because that's the way I was taught. But it doesn't matter what you call it. It's the same thing, whether you call it the genitive stem, or the base. Regardless, it's just the genitive singular form with the ending chopped off. In this case, mortis, you chop off the is, and you're left with mort. That's the genitive stem. And so that's the part of the word that you'll see embedded in English derivatives like mortician, mortuary, mortality. Okay, moving on. We've already talked about isea id, and we've already talked about edem. Let's move on to ob. Ob is a preposition. It has several different meanings, such as on account of or for, as you can see here, are listed. And that first meaning they list, against, I think what they're talking about there is that sometimes ob can mean face-to-face with, like if you go to meet someone and you run into them, you're face-to-face with them. Sometimes ob can mean that, especially when it's prefixed to a verb. Another common meaning is there's a famous Latin saying, quam ob rem, which literally means on account of what thing. So one common meaning for ob is on account of. But I think you need to use the context to translate it best. And especially watch out if you see it prefixed to a verb, because that can mean different things. Next we have respondeo, respondere, respondi, responsum. This is a second conjugation verb. As you can see from the spelling, it's related to our English word respond. You can tell that this verb is second conjugation because of the long E 3 letters from the end in the infinitive form. Respondere. If it had a short E, if it were respondere, that would make it third conjugation, but the long E makes it second conjugation. Okay, let's move on now to section 193, which is the translation part of this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all these exercises, and when you're done, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework assignment. Let's go through these exercises together and see what we can learn from them. Exercise number 1 says, per eos. Okay, per is a preposition that means through. Per takes the accusative case, and it can mean other things besides just through. It can also mean by means of. So here, it's forming a prepositional phrase with a form of is, ea, id. In this particular case, it's accusative plural masculine. Now, you may remember back, I was talking about 2 different flavors of demonstratives, okay? When we have demonstratives, like this and that, they can function as demonstrative adjectives or as demonstrative pronouns. If there's a chocolate chip cookie on the table in front of me, and my daughter is sitting there looking at it, and I'm sitting there looking at it, I can say, do you want this chocolate chip cookie? And in that case, I've used the word this as a demonstrative adjective because it's modifying the chocolate chip cookie, okay? Or I could just point at the cookie and say, do you want this? I didn't need to say chocolate chip cookie because the person I was talking to already knew that I was referring to the chocolate chip cookie. So in that example, the word this is functioning as a demonstrative pronoun. It's by itself, it has substance, and it's referring to a thing, okay? So a pronoun takes the place of a noun. So if I say, this cookie, the word this is an adjective. If I say this, the word this is a pronoun. And it's the same in English as it is in Latin, okay? Here in exercise 1, we just have per eos. Eos is not paired with anything. It's not modifying anything. So what we have here really is a demonstrative pronoun. And it's accusative plural. It's accusative because per takes the accusative. And it's accusative plural because it's talking about more than one thing. It's saying through. We don't know exactly what it is through. It could be, since it's accusative plural masculine, it could be referring to people. It could be translated as through them, meaning through some men, you know. It could be through them in the sense of, you know, through in English sometimes can mean by means of. Like if I say, you know, I'll contact you through email. That means I'll contact you by means of email, okay? Or eos could be referring to, you know, maybe some horses. And someone is referring to the horses. We just simply don't know because we don't have enough context. Again, that's because this is a demonstrative pronoun and it's not paired with anything. So we really don't know. Our best guess would probably be through them, but I suppose it could also mean through those. In number 2, we have a couple more prepositional phrases just for practice. We have cum eis and ab eis. Of course, eis is ablative plural. That's a form of is, ea, id. It's the same for each gender. So cum eis could mean with those, you know, with them. It could be referring really to anything. We just simply don't know. It could be saying with them or with those. So ab eis, you know, ab means from. So ab eis could say from them or from those. Or in other constructions, ab can mean by. So it could be saying by them or by those. We really just don't know. The point here is that eis is ablative plural, and it's a form of id. Number 3, we have a couple more prepositional phrases for practice. Ob eam kalsam. Ob means on account of. And now we have eam, which is a form of id, but it's not being treated as a demonstrative pronoun here. Here you'll notice that it's paired with a noun, kalsam. So here it's acting as a demonstrative adjective. The word kalsam means like cause or reason. So if we translate eam as that or this, it could say on account of that reason or account of this reason. Again, with id, it's hard to know if it's referring to something near you or far from you. This is a kind of a flexible demonstrative. We don't really have good ways to translate it into English except for this and that, and also pronouns like he, she, or it, and sometimes the, I think. That's my opinion. So ob eam kalsam could say on account of that reason, on account of this reason. Ob eas kalsas, well, that's the same thing, but plural, on account of those reasons, or on account of these reasons. Okay, eam is accusative singular feminine, and eas is accusative plural feminine, because ob takes the accusative. Number 4, in eo itinere. This is another prepositional phrase, just for practice. Here we have a form of id acting as an adjective. It's a demonstrative adjective. Eo is ablative singular. Notice that it's paired with a noun, itinere. That's a form of iter, which can mean road, route, way, journey, march. So in can mean in or on. Here in this context, it's probably best to translate it as on. If we translate eo as that, then this phrase could say on that journey, on that march, perhaps. You could probably get away with translating it as on this march or on this journey. Again, id is kind of flexible. Number 5, is pagus. Okay, the word pagus is a masculine noun that means district or canton. And along with is, we can translate it as something like that district or this district. Again, keep in mind that id is not as strong of a demonstrative as the other ones we have available in Latin, which are hic and ille. Number 6 is next, eodem tempore. Okay, tempore is a form of a third declension noun, tempus, Tempus. Tempus looks at first glance like it would be second declension because of the us ending. You might look at that and say, oh, that's a second declension noun, tempus, tempi, right? No, tempus is third declension, and so the genitive singular form is temporis. It's a neuter noun of the third declension, and so the genitive stem is tempor. Okay, so tempore here is ablative singular. The word eodem is a form of īdem, right, which means the same. And so eo is ablative singular, and then it's got the dem ending. So eo is neuter ablative singular. When you have expressions of time in the ablative case, they're often what we call ablative of time. And there are 2 flavors of ablative of time. You have ablative of time when, which tells you when something happens, and there's ablative of time within which tells you a time span within which some event occurs. In my opinion, ablative of time when is much more common. And that's what we have here. It's saying at a time, right? So that's why it's ablative singular, is because it's ablative of time when. And so if you put in the idea of eodem, which means the same, and then put in the idea of time when,
then this expression would say at the same time. Number 7 is next. Magna eorum pars. Here we have the word pars, which means part. Well, pars can mean all kinds of things. It can mean part, side, direction, or it can also mean a political faction, I've been told. Keep those meanings in mind, because as we read Caesar's Gallic Wars, you're going to see the word pars mean the side of, like the side of a mountain, I think, and you're going to see it mean direction. So you're going to see all those meanings, so keep those in mind. And here it's being modified by magna, okay? Here we have sort of a sandwich kind of structure. Magna and pars are sandwiching eorum, which is genitive plural. So magna and pars says a great part. Remember that adjectives of quantity and size oftentimes come before the noun they modify, and that's what we see here. Magna coming before pars. So magna pars says great part or a great part, and then eorum is genitive plural. That means of them or of those. If we're talking about people, it would say a great part of them, and that's probably the best way to translate this one. Number 8 is next. In eam partem. Remember that the word in is a preposition, and that's what we call a two-way preposition. A two-way preposition is a preposition that can take more than one case. So in can take accusative and ablative. You see a lot of two-way prepositions in ancient Greek. You see them in Russian. You see them in German. We don't have too many of them in Latin. We just have a few. But in is one of them. And so when in takes the accusative case, it generally means into. When in takes the ablative case, it can mean in or on. And sometimes in plus the accusative can mean against. So when you see the preposition in, you have to take it along with the case that it's taking to figure out what it's saying. Okay. So here, in is taking the accusative. In exercise 4, we saw it taking the ablative, meaning something completely different. Here, we'll translate it as into, because it's taking the accusative case. Again, partem means part. It can also mean side or direction. And then eam is a form of issa id. It's feminine accusative singular. So for the sake of simplicity, we could just translate number 8 as into that part, or perhaps into this part. You could probably get away with that as well. Number 9 is next. Edem tuba. Notice that both of these are ablative singular. A tuba is a big trumpet that you could use in a military context to give signals. And what we have here is an ablative of means. It's saying by means of the trumpet. And then with edem here, we have the idea of the same trumpet. Okay? Notice that edem is also ablative singular, and the whole thing is just an ablative of means. So number 9 says, by means of the same trumpet, or with the same trumpet. Notice again that edem is paired with a noun, so it's not acting as a demonstrative pronoun, it's acting as a demonstrative adjective. Number 10 is next. Edem oppida. Oppida is the nominative plural form of oppidum, which means town. That's a second declension noun. Of course, it could also be accusative plural, because with neuter nouns, the nominative and accusative forms are the same. And with edem, we have the idea of same. So number 10 says the same towns. Edem is also neuter plural, nominative, along with oppida. Although edem could also be accusative. Number 11 is next. Eorum itinerum. Okay, the noun here is itinerum. That's a form of the noun iter,
which means road, march, way, journey, all those things. And iter is third declension. So here, this ending is showing us that it's genitive plural. So itinerum is saying something like of the marches, or of the journeys, or of the roads, or of the ways. Okay? And eorum is a form of isea id that is also genitive plural. In this case, genitive plural masculine. So we could translate 11 as of those journeys, or probably several other things, but that's about as good a translation as any. Number 14 is next. Idem Caesar audit. And there's a footnote here reminding us that the I in idem here is short. We talked about this a while back. When you add dem to the different forms of isea id, you get some spelling changes. My theory is that the masculine form, as the footnote says, has a long I due to compensatory lengthening. The S goes away, and the I gets lengthened to compensate. Anyway, in the masculine nominative singular form, you get a long I. In the neuter, you get a short I. And that's what we have here. Actually, number 14 is a complete sentence. The subject of the sentence here is Caesar, which is, of course, Julius Caesar. And the verb here is the word audit, which is a form of the verb audio, which means to hear. And that's a fourth conjugation verb. The infinitive is audire. So with an infinitive ending in ire, you know that it's a fourth conjugation verb. So audit is third person singular, present tense. And so Caesar audit together says Caesar hears, or Caesar is hearing. And then idem here is the direct object. Remember, we've talked about demonstrative pronouns versus demonstrative adjectives. Here, idem is not paired with anything. It's functioning on its own as having substance. So it's a demonstrative pronoun. So when we translate it, we have to translate it trying to incorporate into the translation what that pronoun is standing in for. Okay, so the basic idea here is Caesar is hearing the same. Okay, the same what? The same thing, the same story, the same report, the same rumors. We don't know. So the best way to translate it is Caesar is hearing the same thing. That's probably the best rendering here. Notice that idem here is a pronoun, not an adjective. In Latin, we have this flexibility where these demonstratives can be either one, and so you really have to keep your eye on that because it makes a big difference in how you translate. When they act as pronouns, you have to try to figure out the context, and you have to try to represent that meaning, whatever the meaning is, you have to try to represent that in your translation. Number 15 is next. Idem Diwikiakos Haideus respondet. Okay, the subject here is Diwikiakos. That's a person's name. He's one of the Gallic tribesmen that we meet in Caesar's Gallic Wars. And the word Diwikiakos has two other words along with it, Edem and Haideus. Okay, Haideus is an adjective that means Haiduin in the sense of belonging to the tribe known as the Haidui. In the texts that I've seen of Caesar's Gallic Wars, this word is spelled without the H. It's just Haidui. That's the tribe. But for some reason here they have an H and it's Haidui. I don't think it matters a whole lot because I don't think that the letter H was pronounced very strongly at the beginnings of Latin words. In fact, for those of you who know Spanish, you know that the H in Spanish is completely silent. So if your name in Spanish is Hugo, then a Spanish speaker would say Hugo. In fact, there's a funny poem about this by the ancient Roman poet Catullus. He writes a whole poem about a friend of his who pronounced the name of the Ionian Sea
Instead of Ionian, he said Hionian. And so Catullus pokes fun at him for that. That's Catullus 84. So anyway, Douikiakos Haiduus means Douikiakos the Haiduan. That is the person who is a member of the Haidui tribe. So Edem means the same. And notice the long I there. That's masculine nominative singular. So Edem Douikiakos Haiduus would say something like the same Douikiakos, the Haiduan, as if someone or somebody had mentioned him before, and now we're going to talk about him again. Hey, it's that same Douikiakos I was talking about before, that kind of thing. And the verb here is respondet. This is a form of the second conjugation verb respondeo. That's actually one of our new vocabulary words for this lesson. So number 15 as a whole says, the same Douikiakos, the Haiduan, is responding. Or perhaps better yet, the same Douikiakos, the Haiduan, is answering. Number 16 is next. Eadem legione quam habebat. Here we are revisiting the relative clause stuff that we learned in the previous lesson, lesson 21. And this really is not even a full sentence. It's just more of a fragment of a sentence for practice. Let's look at eadem legione first. Legione is a form of the noun legio, which is a third declension noun that means legion. Here it's ablative singular. And it's got a form of īdem along with it. Okay, it's got eadem, which is feminine ablative singular. So it agrees perfectly with legione. It could be an ablative of means. So we might say, by means of the same legion. That's about the only way I know how to make sense of it. And then we have a relative clause, quam habebat. And we'll translate that as, which he had. Okay, habebat is imperfect tense, third person singular, and quam is the relative pronoun that starts this relative clause. Okay, it's accusative, singular, feminine. It's singular and feminine because of its antecedent, which is legione. But it's accusative because within this relative clause, it's the direct object. It's the direct object of habebat. So if we flip around the relative clause, we might say, he had which. So number 16 as a whole says, by means of the same legion which he had. Number 17 is next. Is bellum gessit. Okay, here we have a form of isea id as the subject. Okay, it's masculine, nominative singular, and it's not paired with anything. It's not modifying anything. So it's not working as a demonstrative adjective. It's working as a demonstrative pronoun. And when isea id is just by itself like that, you can translate it as he, she, or it. Again, it's not a strong demonstrative like this or that. You know, it's not strong. It's more of a weak demonstrative. So you could translate it as, you know, the guy, you know, that guy, this guy. It's really kind of flexible. But with that kind of weak demonstrative flavor to it, sometimes just a simple pronoun is the best way to translate it, like he, she, or it. So here, with the masculine nominative singular form, you could probably just translate it as he, and that's about the best way to render it. The verb here is gessit, which is a form of the verb gero. Okay, gero means to carry or bear, and so this form here, gessit, is perfect tense, third person singular. So it means he, she, or it bore, or he, she, or it carried. When it works along with the word bellum, bellum, by the way, is a second declension neuter noun that means war. So when you put bellum and gero together, it forms sort of an idiom or a kind of a stock phrase that means to wage war, okay? So bellum gero would mean I wage war, Bellum Garrus would mean you wage war. Bellum Garret, he, she, or it wages war. So here in the perfect tense, gesset would mean he, she, or it waged war in the past. So number 17 as a whole says this: he waged war. Number 18 is next. Orgeterix id eis persuasit. Okay, the subject is orgeterix, and the verb here is a form of the verb persuadeo, which means to persuade or to make something persuasive to someone, right? To be persuasive toward someone. And here it is perfect tense. So orgeterix persuaded, and then eis is dative plural. That's a form of is id. We could translate it as them and say orgeterix persuaded them. Keep in mind that persuadeo always takes the dative. But in this particular sentence, we have a thing that they're persuading, and that's id. And as you can see in the footnote, it says that id is the direct object of persuasit. So literally it says orgeterix persuaded it to them, in the sense of orgeterix made this thing persuasive to them, something like that. In the footnote, they say to translate it as of this, and that's fine. You can say orgeterix persuaded them of this. That's good English, but I want you to understand that the Latin is not saying that literally. Literally, it is the direct object of persuasit. So orgeterix persuaded it to them, in the sense of he persuaded an idea to them, he persuaded a plan to them. Okay, id is a neuter accusative singular form of is id, and it's functioning as a demonstrative pronoun. So whatever it's representing, you got to put that in your translation. You got to figure out the context. We don't have much context here, but whatever the id is representing, that's the thing he's persuading people of, whether it be a plan or an idea or something like that. Number 19 is next. Orgeterix ae suam filiam dot. Okay, the subject is orgeterix, and the verb here is dot, a form of do, which means give. So do, das, dot, third person singular. So orgeterix gives, or orgeterix is giving. That's the subject and verb. And so suam filiam means his own daughter, okay? Filia means daughter. And remember that we talked about when you use suis, sua, suum, that means his or her or its, meaning that it belongs to the subject of the sentence. So oftentimes people translate as his own or her own or its own. If it said filiam eius, that would mean the daughter of some other person, not orgeterix. If it said orgeterix filiam eius dot, that would mean that orgeterix is giving someone else's daughter. Okay, but here it's suam filiam, so he's giving his own daughter. And the idea here is that he's giving her in marriage. Finally, we have ae, that's a form of is id. And remember what we talked about earlier about the naughty 9 adjectives, okay? Naughty 9 adjectives, like alias, they have two interesting characteristics. They have ius as the genitive singular ending, and they have a long I as the dative singular ending. Okay, and so isea id is similar to that in the sense that isea id has those same features in the genitive and dative. So the dative singular masculine form of isea id is not ao, okay? EO is not the dative singular. That's the ablative singular, but not the dative. The dative is unexpectedly E and then a long I, AE. Okay, so AE here is dative singular, and so the idea is orgeterix is giving his own daughter to him. Okay, AE is representing some guy that orgeterix is giving his daughter to. Notice that AE here is functioning as a demonstrative pronoun because it's not paired with anything. Number 20 is next. Post eos mortem helvetii convenerunt. Okay, the subject here is Helvetii. That's a Gallic tribe. If there's just one of them, it would be a Helvetius. But in the plural, it's Helvetii, second declension. Convenerunt is a form of the verb convenio, which means literally to come together or assemble. Okay, this is perfect tense, so it's they assembled, third person plural, perfect tense. So Helvetii convenerunt means the Helvetii assembled. Okay, so that leaves us with post eos mortem. Post and mortem together form a prepositional phrase, after the death. Okay, post means after, mortem is accusative singular, it means death. That's a third declension noun. And so they're sandwiching the word eos. Remember what I said about eos a moment ago? If you say suus sua suum, it means his, her, or its own as belonging to the subject of the sentence. If you say eos, it means it's somebody else's. You're talking about someone else other than the subject of the sentence. So we'll translate post eos mortem as after his death, meaning after some other guy's death, not the Helvetii. Okay, the Helvetii are the subject of the sentence, but it's not their death, it's some other guy's death. If the sentence said post suam mortem Helvetii convenerunt, you could translate that as the Helvetii assembled after their own death, which would not make any sense. Okay, because suus sua suum would suggest that it's the Helvetii involved there, that it's their own death. And so eos here is telling us it's the death of some other person other than the Helvetii, okay? So the reason I'm comparing them is just so you can see how it would differ with each of those words inserted, okay? So number 20 as a whole says, after his death, the Helvetii assembled. And we don't know who the eos is referring to. There's no context. Theoretically, eos could be referring to a woman or someone represented by a neuter gender, because eos is the same in all genders. It's genitive singular for masculine, feminine, and neuter. Contextually, in Caesar's Gallic Wars, it's talking about orgeterix, so we know it's a male here, but grammatically, eos could be referring to any gender. So number 20 could read after her death, after its death, or after his death. Number 21 is next. Ab eistem nostra consilia enuntiantur. Okay, the verb here is enuntiantur. That's a form of the verb, well, it's really a form of the verb nuntio, which means to announce. And then with the preposition e on the front, it's like to announce forth. A or X, that preposition means out of. So enuntio means like to announce out or to speak out. So this particular one is third person plural, present tense, but it's passive. So enuntiantur, notice the ending is ntur. So what it says is that some things are being announced. We don't know what's being announced, but the verb itself is saying that plural things are being announced, passive. Okay, and the subject here is consilia. That's the nominative plural form of concilium, which means plan. And so there we have our subject. Those are the things that are being announced. Okay, so consilia enuntiantur says the plans are being announced. Nostra is modifying consilia. Nostra means our, O-U-R, so our plans are being announced. And finally, we have a prepositional phrase, ab eistem. Eistem is a form of isea id, so it's going to mean same, right? And notice that here it's functioning as a demonstrative pronoun. It's not paired with anything, so it's not saying the same men, the same troops, the same people. It's just saying the same. So we have to use context to figure out what that demonstrative pronoun is really referring to. Along with the preposition ob here, what we have is called an ablative of agent. Okay, the preposition a or ob plus the ablative case can show by whom passive activity is being done. Okay, so we have passive activity occurring with the verb enuntiantur. Something is being done to something. Okay, announcing is being done to plans. But who's doing it? Well, ob īdem tells us it's by the same. Okay, and so we need to throw in a word here to show who the īdem is referring to. Is it by the same people, by the same guys, by the same soldiers? Again, īdem is a demonstrative pronoun that is acting with substance to it. It's not just an adjective modifying something else. It's a pronoun, so who is it referring to? For simplicity, let's just say people. Let's say our plans are being announced by the same people. Okay, so ob is a preposition that takes the ablative. Eis is ablative plural. That's an ablative of agent. It's showing by whom passive activity is being done. Okay, so number 21 as a whole says, our plans are being announced by the same people. Number 22, Caesar eodem itinere quo hostes ierant ad eos contendit. Okay, here we have a sentence with a subject, a verb, a main clause, and then a relative clause embedded in it, plus another little phrase, which is an ablative of means. Okay, so the main clause is Caesar ad eos contendit. That's the main clause. And then the relative clause is quo hostes ierant. So let's look at the main clause. Caesar ad eos contendit. Okay, Caesar is the subject. Contendit is the verb. And the verb contendit is a form of contendo, which means to strive, fight, or hasten. Here it's perfect tense, third person singular. So the idea is Caesar hastened, and then ad eos means to them. Okay, eos is accusative plural, a form of is, ea, id, and we can simply translate it as them. Okay, so Caesar hastened to them. And how did he hasten to them? He hastened to them eodem itinere, which means by the same route. Okay, itinere is ablative singular. It's a form of the noun iter, a third declension noun, which means route, way, road, journey, march. And it's got a form of īdem along with it, an ablative singular neuter form of īdem. So eodem itinere means by means of the same route. Okay, so here's what we have so far. Caesar hastened to them by means of the same route. Now, the relative clause is going to tell us a bit more about this route. Okay, so itinere is going to be the antecedent for the upcoming relative clause. Okay, the relative pronoun here is quo. Quo hostes ierant is the relative clause. Within the relative clause, hostes is the subject. That means enemies. It's a third declension nominative plural. And ierant, you can see we have a footnote about that, means had gone. Don't worry about the form of ierant. Just, accept that verb with that particular English meaning. So in the relative clause, we have hostes, and we have them going somewhere. Okay, hostes, the enemies had gone. And then quo is a relative pronoun in the ablative singular. Okay, so we'll translate it as by which or by means of which. Okay, so how does quo work along with its antecedent? which is itinere. Okay, quo is singular because itinere, its antecedent, is singular. Quo is neuter because its antecedent itinere is neuter. But quo is ablative because of the role it's playing in the relative clause. It's saying by means of which. So that's an ablative of means, and that's why it's ablative. So the relative clause says, by means of which the enemies had gone. So number 22 as a whole says this: Caesar hastened to them by the same route by which the enemies had gone. Number 23 is next. Germani sunt īdem, quibuscum helvetii contenderunt. Okay, here we have a main clause and then a relative clause. The main clause is Germani sunt īdem, and the relative clause is quibuscum helvetii contenderunt. The relative pronoun that starts the relative clause is quibus. So let's look at our main clause. The main clause is Germani sunt īdem. Germani is the subject. That's nominative plural. It means the Germans. Sunt is third person plural. It means they are. So Germani and sunt basically just means the Germans are. And then īdem is a predicate nominative. Okay, ae is nominative plural. And with the dem ending, it's īdem, which means the same. Notice that it is functioning as a demonstrative pronoun, but we know who it's talking about because of the context. We know it's referring to the Germans. So what we can say here with Germani sunt īdem is the Germans are the same in the sense of the Germans are the same people, the same tribesmen, the same human beings. For simplicity's sake, let's just say people. The Germans are the same people, okay? So we need to throw in the word people in our translation to express that īdem is referring to human beings, okay? So the Germans are the same people, and then we have this relative clause, quibuscum helvetii contenderunt. Within the relative clause, the helvetii are the subject. That's a Gallic tribe. Contenderunt, that's a form of contendo, which means strive, fight, or hasten. And here it means fight or strive. Strive is just a fancy word for struggling or something like that. So fighting is probably the best way to translate this. Contenderunt is perfect tense, third person plural, so it means they fought. Okay, so helvetii contenderunt says the helvetii fought. And then quibus, notice that it's got cum attached to it. So it's cum quibus, which means with whom. Okay, quibus is ablative plural. Of course, cum, the preposition, takes the ablative. The antecedent of quibus here is the Germans. And so quibus is plural because it's antecedent. Germani is plural. I guess you could maybe say that īdem is the antecedent. Either way, it doesn't matter because it's plural and masculine. So quibus is plural and masculine because of its antecedent, but it's ablative because within the relative clause, it's the object of the preposition cum. So number 23 as a whole says, the Germans are the same people with whom the helvetii fought. Okay, that's it for lesson 22. Thanks for listening. I hope you're enjoying this lecture series. Remember that if at all possible, it would behoove you to try to say something in Latin. Try to speak it. If you're by yourself, that can be tough because you don't really have anyone to speak Latin with. But what you can do is, I guess what I call narration, when you just describe things happening. In your mind, you can see a picture of something happening, and you can describe it in Latin. You can imagine, for example, a Gallic tribesman giving his daughter in marriage to someone, and then you could say, as you imagine that picture in your mind, you could say, Orgeterix suam filiam dat. You know, you can just say the Latin for what is happening. Don't think about English, just think about the Latin words and what they mean without any English intermediary or translation in the way. You could imagine two groups of people on the same road, and you could think to yourself, in eodem attendere, on the same road. Okay, so there's lots of ways that you can start to verbalize and just say things in Latin. Simple things, easy things. But if you do it a little bit each day, it's going to help you develop sort of a comfort or a familiarity or a glibness with the language. So it's great to, read Latin. It's great to know the grammar rules, but add to that listening and speaking. Those are two things you can add to your language experience that will help you learn faster and better. And in my book, Keep Going with Latin, that's the main focus of the whole book. So if you go through that book, you'll get plenty of spoken Latin exercise. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next time in Lesson 23.